All right, part 3 of chapter 13, we're going to cover the kingdom of fungi. So these are one of my favorite groups to cover. There's a lot of variety, a lot of interesting stuff, and mushrooms are cool. Who doesn't like mushrooms? So let's first of all go through the characteristics. Remember, for each group that we cover, you're going to need to be able to recognize certain characteristics, right? Like, are they multicellular or unicellular? Are they eukaryotic or prokaryotic? So on and so forth, right? So we're talking about fungi. We're talking about eukaryotes. So remember, the only prokaryotes are bacteria and archaea, 2 out of 3 domains of life. But if it's not bacteria and it's not archaea, it's a eukaryote. So all fungi are eukaryotes. The name fungi comes from the Latin terms fungos, which means mushroom. So there's a reason when you think about fungi, you think about mushrooms, even though the group includes over 100,000 identified species, probably way more than that that aren't identified. But some examples of organisms that belong in the group are not just the edible and inedible mushrooms, but also things like yeast, mold, including things like Penicillium notatum, which is the first mold that was shown to produce antimicrobial compounds, so antibiotics. Again, fungi are eukaryotes. They are also heterotrophs, so they do not make their own food. For a significant period of history, fungi were grouped in with plants. They are considered to be sort of plant-like, and that makes sense because they grow out of the ground, right? Mushrooms especially. So they sort of appear to act like plants, but they're really not closely related to plants at all. In fact, as we saw in our phylogenetic tree of protists in the last lecture, fungi are actually genetically more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So they are not photosynthetic. You'll find 0 examples of photosynthesis in the fungi kingdom. They're all heterotrophs, and heterotrophs, remember, means they eat something else. They have to obtain their food from another organism, from an outside source. Fungi are mainly saprobes, and you can recall from lecture 2 from this chapter that saprobes are organisms that break down other organisms' tissues, so dead tissues or waste matter, things like that. So we rely on fungi just like we do on protists and on bacteria to decompose organisms or tissues or waste matters, to break those materials down and return those nutrients to the system. So fungi do this in kind of an interesting way. So if you think about comparing fungi and animals, so we're both heterotrophs, we both need to get our food from another source. We ingest our food, we put it into our mouth and into our digestive system, and we use enzymes, chemicals, to break down our food, and then we absorb the nutrients from our food from within our digestive system into our body. So fungi do it kind of in the opposite direction. So they secrete what are called exoenzymes, meaning enzymes that work outside of the organism's tissues. So these are digestive enzymes. They work really similarly to the ones that break down the molecules in our food, but they do it on the outside. So fungi sit on the surface of their food, whatever it is that they're decomposing or going to use as nutrition. They secrete those exoenzymes onto the surface of the food, and then it digests externally. And then they use specialized structures called hyphae to absorb that nutrition into their tissues. So they're sort of digesting their food externally and absorbing it that way, which is sort of the opposite of how animals do it, which is just kind of cool to think about. So reproduction, fungi use spores. They can do so asexually or sexually, meaning they produce spores. In some cases, those spores will just grow into another whole organism. In other cases, the spores will germinate, and then those structures will find a mating type and join up with that and go through a whole process of sexual reproduction. So it can use either way, but always through spores. And most fungi are multicellular, so something like a mushroom you would expect to be multicellular. It's large, it's visible with the naked eye. But things like yeasts are unicellular. So they belong in the same kingdom, but they're unicellular. So if I ask you about cellularity of fungi, unicellular or multicellular. But if I ask you eukaryote versus prokaryote every time. If I ask you about photosynthesis, never, right? If I ask you heterotroph versus autotroph, always heterotrophic. So always going to be eating their food, getting their nutrition from another source. They're not making their own. So those are your characteristics of fungi. We'll go through a few notable species, just like we did with the other group with the protists. So plenty of pathogenic fungi. Fungi can be parasites, they can be pathogens, they can even be predators. So there is a really cool group of fungi that actually, they grow underground. Lots of fungi do that. They grow most of their vegetative parts of their body or their tissues under the soil. This particular genus will actually grow their specialized hyphae, these little sort of, let's call them like feelers almost, under the soil, and they'll actually trap worms that live in the dirt. So that's kind of cool. So there are predatory fungi, which is interesting to think about as well. So most fungal plant diseases, and we're talking about plant pathogens, most of the ones that we care about anyway are going to be crop diseases. If it's not a crop, we probably don't care, right? Because it doesn't really affect the food supply or human health in any way. And so most of the time when we're looking at fungi that cause diseases in plants, it's those that cost us something in terms of crops. So if you get a plant that has a fungal infection, it's either going to cause the tissue to decay before you ever get to it, or make it impossible to eat that crop because it's infested with fungi that are producing toxins. So lots of fungi produce alkaloids, which are toxic substances to really for protection, to keep organisms from eating them, but they can cause all kinds of problems if they are ingested. So that's a common way that fungi can spoil your crop plants. They also cause rotting of stored crops. So if you think about taking, let's say, for example, wheat. Let's say you've harvested your wheat and you've got it stored in some sort of a grain silo of some kind. If you get fungi, if you get spores in there and those spores germinate, think about the way that fungi eat. So they secrete exoenzymes, they're digesting food and absorbing the nutrients through their hyphae. So what you're really seeing when you see rot that's caused by fungi is actually their exoenzymes at work at digesting that tissue to absorb the nutrients. So they're really just eating it. So the next time that you go into your refrigerator and you see some mold growing on strawberries, that fuzzy stuff that you're seeing, those are actually hyphae. Those are reproductive bodies of that mold. And they've probably gone ahead and grown some of those hyphae down into the strawberry itself, but it's soft and it's mushy. You don't want to eat it because you might get sick or it might just be gross. But what that fungi is doing is actually eating that strawberry. So not that that makes it any less disgusting or more disappointing, any less disappointing when you go to get your strawberries and they're covered in mold, but maybe just give you a different way to sort of look at what's going on sort of from a biological position. Okay, so the one species on this slide that you need to know the scientific name of to recognize in a test question potentially is Claviceps purpurea. Claviceps is the fungus known as ergot fungus. It mainly infects cereal crops like rye, and it causes reduced yield. So it just decreases the health of the plant overall, and you get less rye produced. Also, Claviceps produces some of those toxic alkaloids. In this case, the Claviceps purpurea alkaloids can cause convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, which is tissue death caused by lack of blood flow, and also milk in cattle to dry up. So if you get cattle that are grazing in a field that eat this ergot, it can be bad for your cattle. If you yourself ingest it, it can be toxic and cause problems. Interestingly, sort of why this particular fungus is notable is that the active ingredient in ergot is lysergic acid. And lysergic acid is the precursor to the drug LSD, which people use to induce hallucinations. So that's kind of an interesting tie-in to something that you may have heard of in popular culture. But that's because it's a fungal toxin that's produced that causes those hallucinations. So that's claviceps. So make sure you're at least familiar with that one. Um, in addition to things like causing hallucinations, you can also be poisoned by eating toxic mushrooms. So there are probably significantly more mushrooms that you should not eat than that you can. The tricky thing about eating mushrooms in the wild is that there are lots of species that look edible, or they look like a species that is edible and maybe even delicious, but they are themselves incredibly toxic and sometimes even deadly if you ingest them. But they may look exactly alike. So unless you are an expert, don't eat mushrooms that you find in the woods, okay? Some people are allergic to mold spores, so you may have a mold allergy where you actually inhale the spores and it causes allergic symptoms similar to people who are allergic to animal dander or to pollen. So that's an issue for some folks with fungi. And then you can also have what are called mycoses. So myco, M-Y-C-O, that root word is going to almost always mean fungi. So if you see the term mycosis, think fungal condition. If you see mycota, generally talking about fungi. So myco means fungi. So mycosis is a fungal infection. Lots of examples of mycoses are what we would describe as superficial, meaning they're on the surface. So lots of cutaneous fungal infections or cutaneous mycoses. Cutaneous refers to your cutaneous tissue, which is another name for your skin. So not too uncommon for fungi to colonize skin tissue directly and infect the surface and cause something like ringworm, for example, or athlete's foot, or jock itch, or onychomycosis, which is pictured here. That's a scientific name for what we call fungus nails. So frequently you have these superficial infections. Because they're superficial, they're not terribly risky for the overall health of the patient. You can generally treat them with over-the-counter antifungal creams or powders or sprays because they're on the surface. But you can also get more serious mycoses that are referred to as systemic mycoses, where the infection actually spreads to your internal organs. Because it's hard for fungi to get through your skin, most of the time when you're talking about a systemic fungal infection or a systemic mycosis, it's because someone has inhaled spores. Two examples of these types of systemic mycoses: coccidioidomycosis, also called valley fever, so much easier to pronounce, is a common fungal systemic mycosis that's common in the southwestern US. The spores travel freely because it's very dry and dusty. If you inhale those spores, you can end up with this mycosis that causes respiratory symptoms similar to what you might see in tuberculosis, so coughing and fluid in the lungs and inflammation and things like that. The second one on the list is histoplasmosis. It's also a pulmonary infection or lung infection. But in addition to affecting the lung tissue, it can also cause swelling of the meninges. And the meninges are the protective layers of tissue that surround your brain and spinal cord. So if you hear about meningitis, that's inflammation of those protective coverings. So that can be pretty serious. Treatment for systemic mycoses requires antifungal medications that are taken systemically, so not like a powder or cream that you can put on the surface, but that actually has to be introduced systemically to fight that mycosis. But frequently with antifungal treatments like that, you can have some pretty serious side effects. And the problem is fungi are pretty closely related to animals genetically. So we share a lot of the same metabolic pathways. We share a lot of the same cellular strategies, ways of doing things. And so if you are developing a medication that can interrupt those metabolic pathways in a fungal pathogen, it can also cause interruptions in the cells of the human that's infected. So can be pretty serious to treat systemic mycoses. And antibiotics don't work. We know why, because if you go back to the first lecture for chapter 13, we were talking about bacteria. Antibiotics are designed to interrupt the metabolic pathways of bacteria, not going to do anything to a fungus. So you have to have specific antifungal medications. There's also a category of what we call opportunistic fungal infections. Any pathogen can be opportunistic. That just means that they are generally harmless, but if there is an opportunity, hence the term opportunistic, they can take hold. So we're usually talking about people who have compromised or under-functioning immune systems. So a really good example of this, an example of an opportunistic fungal systemic mycosis is pneumocystic pneumonia. It's caused by a fungus called pneumocystis, and it's very common in patients who have late stage AIDS caused by the HIV virus. So once the HIV virus has progressed to the point where you actually have full-blown acquired immune deficiency syndrome, that fungus, which wouldn't really cause too much of a problem in a person with a functional immune system, can actually take hold in the lungs of an AIDS patient and cause pneumonia. So with HIV and AIDS, it's not the virus itself that kills the patient. It's a secondary infection that the patient gets that they can't fight off because their immune system is depleted by the HIV infection. So pneumocystic pneumonia is a pretty common example of a secondary infection that can be pretty risky or even fatal for AIDS patients. Another example of an opportunistic fungal infection that's much less serious is that caused by Candida. And Candida species are pretty ubiquitous. They are present in your body, on your skin, and your mucous membranes. And generally, as long as your pH levels are balanced and your bacterial communities are healthy, your microbiome is in good shape, the yeasts sort of are held in check. But sometimes when the environment changes for whatever reason, maybe you have an infection of some kind, or you've been taking antibiotics, which has killed off some of your good bacteria, it allows that Candida to sort of switch phase and colonize, and then you end up with something like a yeast infection. So those would be considered opportunistic fungal infections. But again, the same pattern we're going to follow that we followed with bacteria and that we followed with protists. We're going to talk about those pathogens, so make sure you're familiar with those. And then we'll summarize the rest of the section on fungi by talking about some beneficial fungal species. So again, as we mentioned, like bacteria, like protists, many protists, fungi are major decomposers. They're saprobes, right? They're breaking down tissues of organisms. They're breaking down dead organisms. They're breaking down waste materials that would generally be insoluble, meaning they just sit there. And that breakdown process returns those nutrients that are stored in those tissues back into the ecosystem. So things like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus that are built into those tissues of those living things are re-released and returned to the system. So really important decomposers in the ecosystem sort of cycle of things. So fungi also form some really important symbiotic relationships. Remember we talked about symbioses in the protist section of this chapter, where we're talking about endosymbiosis, and basically symbiosis is just those two species that are living together, closely interacting and dependent upon one another. Mycorrhizae is a critically important symbiotic relationship between plants and fungi. So the way that mycorrhizae work, first of all, let's look at the word. So myco, remember, means fungus. Rhizae, the R-H-I-Z part, rhizae or rhizo, is going to refer to roots, plant roots. So somewhere between 80 and 90% of all plants, maybe even a little bit higher than that, participate in some form of mycorrhizal interaction. And what that means is that there are fungal hyphae, so the long sort of stringy underground growing portion of the fungi are interacting really closely with the plant roots, and they're benefiting from that relationship. Both parties are benefiting. So what the fungi get out of the deal is the ability to they sort of share some of the photosynthetic products that the plant is making. So the plant roots and the fungal hyphae. You can sort of see this illustration here. On the left side of the picture, there are no fungal hyphae illustrated. On the right side, you have all of this whole network of mycorrhizal hyphae or extensions of the fungal partner itself. So you're seeing the plant root itself giving some sugar that's been produced through photosynthesis to this fungal partner. And the fungal partner in return is giving mineral nutrients from the soil to the plant. So if you look just at this, at the diameter, at the size of the tissue, a plant root is a whole lot thicker and sort of bulky than these little, very small diameter hyphal structures from the fungus. So fungal hyphae are better at getting in between the particles of soil. They're better at pulling inorganic mineral nutrients out of the soil than plant roots are. But they can't photosynthesize. So they're really good at getting things, minerals and things out of the soil that the plant is less efficient at acquiring for itself. So they do that part, and they share those minerals with the plant. And in exchange, the plant gives the fungi some sugar because it's good at doing photosynthesis. And so the two both benefit from the relationship. The reason that this is so important as humans is that we rely so heavily on plants for food. And if 90% of plant species require this mycorrhizal interaction or depend on the mycorrhizal interaction with the fungi to be healthy and produce well, then it all flows up through the food chain, right? So those mycorrhizal interactions are critical for the health of the plant. And because we depend on plants for food, then we also depend on the mycorrhizal interaction. So really important there. The last sort of relationship that I want to mention really quickly is lichen. So you've probably seen lichen on tree bark or growing on rocks. We mentioned lichen in our discussion about peppered moths in the very first chapter about evolution. So lichen are these sort of crusty looking things. There are also hairy looking lichens and scaly looking lichens, but lichens are just, you are probably familiar with what it is. You may not be familiar with the idea that lichens are a symbiosis between a fungal partner and either an algae, which is a photosynthetic protist, or cyanobacteria, which is a photosynthetic prokaryote. So the relationship that's going on in a lichen is the same idea as what's going on in a mycorrhizal interaction between a plant and a fungus, only this time you've got a microscopic photosynthesizer and a fungus. So instead of having a big plant photosynthetic partner with a fungus, like you have in mycorrhizal interactions, you've got a little photosynthetic partner, an algae or a cyanobacterium, and a fungal partner. And together, they do the same thing. The photosynthetic partner gives the sugar, the fungal partner donates some of its excess mineral nutrition, and together they form lichen. The cool thing about lichen is that without either one of the two partners, it doesn't exist. So lichen is only lichen if both of those, both species are participating in that symbiosis. They're also really good bioindicators, as we did also mention when we were talking about the Industrial Revolution and how the pollution as a result of that caused lichens to sort of die off in the area where the peppered moths were being observed. They are sensitive to environmental changes. And so you can also sort of use it as a gauge of the health of an ecosystem. Presence of lichen, healthy lichen population, probably stable ecosystem. When you see them start to die off, it can be an indicator of pollution or other problems. All right, so other benefits of fungi that are specific to people. Agricultural applications, so you can use fungi as pesticides. So there are lots of fungi that act as pathogens on insects, certain types of insects, but are harmless to other animals and harmless to plants. So if you use that particular type of fungi, apply it to your crops, you can potentially target pest species with fungal infection that will affect that pest species but not affect the plant or the people that eat the plant. So interesting application for agriculture. You can also inoculate your soil where you're growing crops with mycorrhizal fungal spores. So what inoculate means is to just mix it in, to expose it. Right? So you can take spores of fungi that you know produce nice, healthy mycorrhizal interactions with plant roots. You can mix that into your soil, and then helps your crops to sort of establish that mycorrhizal interaction right off the bat instead of waiting for it to sort of happen naturally. So kind of like fertilizer, but not really fertilizer. So an interesting application there as well. Food and beverages, so plenty of edible mushrooms, Agaricus bisporus, that's your typical white button mushroom, grocery store mushroom. Morels, chanterelles, shiitakes, all mushrooms that people use in cooking. Truffles, super expensive, hard to find. Gourmet mushrooms. We use molds, which are also fungi, to ripen cheeses, things like blue cheese and gorgonzola and things that you see with the veins of mold sort of running through them. So we use it for that particular purpose. We also use yeast for fermentation, and that's huge, you guys. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a particular species that is known as both brewer's yeast and baker's yeast. And it's used to make beer and wine. It's used to make bread. So that fermentation process is critical to quite a few products that we use for food and drinks. When you talk about medicine and research, probably the most important medical breakthrough, arguably one of the most important medical breakthroughs in the 20th century, was the discovery of penicillin. We talked about how that discovery and development of antibiotics changed the mortality rate of bacterial infections tremendously, actually given the human population a huge boost from population numbers wise, for better or for worse. We'll talk about that in some later chapters as well, but huge deal, penicillin, right? We also get other compounds from fungi that we use in making medications. So things like cyclosporine, which is an immunosuppressant drug given to patients who have had organ transplants or tissue transplants to suppress their own immune system to keep them from rejecting those transplanted tissues. That is fungal in origin. Ergot alkaloids, remember ergot, that's the fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions. If it's ingested, it's the fungus that gives us the precursor to LSD, right? But it also causes gangrene, remember, which is lack of blood flow to tissues. So it causes vasoconstriction, which means your blood vessels get smaller and blood flow can stop. In certain circumstances, that's really bad, right? But if you need to stop bleeding, you can use that to your advantage. So we actually use ergot alkaloids in medications that are used to control bleeding. The last little bullet here is talking about two species of what we consider model organisms, which are research organisms that are used in laboratory investigations for a couple of different reasons. So the species that are listed here, Neurospora crassa is a common one. And there's S. cerevisiae, that's Saccharomyces. That's the same yeast that we use for brewer's yeast and baker's yeast. It's also used a lot in research. The reason that these are great model organisms, first of all, they're eukaryotes. So their cells behave in a lot of similar ways metabolically to how animal cells behave. But they're single-celled and they're easy to grow in a lab, and they have a really small genome, so they don't have that many genes, so it's easier to study the genetic pathways that govern their metabolism. And so for all of those reasons, they're really valuable as research organisms. So lots of good things come from fungi, not just mycoses and hallucinogenic drugs. And that is it for chapter 3. So that wraps fungi. And that's all the content for, chapter 13.